Have you ever stopped to really think about what it means to be neurotypical? I feel
Hmm.
like it's a question we're hearing more and more these days,
Yeah.
especially with all the talk about neurodiversity, which is something we're really fascinated by
Definitely.
and love to kind of unpack.
Yeah.
So today we are taking a deep dive into autism spectrum disorder, or ASD.
And going way beyond, like those social media self-diagnosis trends,
Oh, yeah.
which we all know can be
Totally a minefield.
a bit of a minefield.
Right.
You've provided us with a really fascinating video transcript that looks at the science and the history and even some of the controversies around ASD.
Yeah, it really gets into those nuances
Yeah.
in a way that, like, I haven't seen before.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Right.
when we say ASD, what are we actually talking about?
That's a great question because there are a lot of misconceptions out there.
Yeah.
For starters, we have to remember that ASD is a spectrum.
Okay.
It's not a single point on a line.
Right.
It really does cover a very wide range of experiences and challenges and looks different for absolutely everyone.
So ditch that image of Rain Man we all have in our heads.
Exactly.
Okay.
That stereotype, while, based on a real person's extraordinary abilities, doesn't even begin to capture like the diversity of the autism spectrum.
Speaking of things that don't really capture the full picture,
Hmm.
the video mentions Asperger's syndrome, which I definitely remember hearing a lot about, but it seems like that term's kind of gone out of style.
It has, and for good reason.
Correct.
Asperger's is no longer considered a separate diagnosis. It's been integrated into this broader umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. The video actually brings up Elon Musk's comments about having Asperger's.
Oh, right.
And I think it highlights the confusion around this outdated terminology.
So it's less about labeling someone with one specific condition and more about recognizing where they fall on this
Right.
spectrum of traits and support needs.
Precisely. And one of the most interesting things I found in the video was this statistic about ASD diagnoses. They've increased significantly in recent years, but the proportion of those severely affected is actually dropping.
Okay, now that is seriously interesting. What is going on there?
Well, there are a few factors at play. First, awareness of ASD has skyrocketed, leading to better recognition and diagnosis,
Yeah.
especially in cases that might have been missed in the past.
Which makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
We're just getting better at recognizing something that's always kind of been there.
Exactly.
But what about the why behind ASD? What's actually going on in the brain?
Hmm.
This is where the video really blew my mind.
Yeah.
Did you know scientists can see differences in brain development before ASD symptoms even show up?
Yeah, it's true. And it's really a game changer in terms of understanding ASD.
Wow.
These differences, often visible in brain scans before the age of 2, give us really critical clues about what's happening neurologically.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are those differences?
Well, research has shown, for example, that individuals with ASD tend to have fewer connections or synapses between neurons in the regions of the brain that are associated with social interaction,
Okay.
like the prefrontal cortex, for instance.
Yeah.
This might help explain some of those social and communication challenges that folks on the spectrum experience.
That's fascinating. So their brains are literally wired differently when it comes to that social processing.
Exactly.
Huh.
But here's a fascinating counterpoint to that. Studies also show that many people with ASD actually have more connections in brain areas related to sensory processing.
Oh.
The visual cortex, the auditory cortex.
Interesting. So it's not always about less connectivity. It's about different strengths and areas of emphasis.
You got it. And this difference in brain wiring could help explain why some people with ASD might be super sensitive to sensory input, like loud noises or bright lights,
Right.
while others might have just this incredible eye for detail or a heightened sense of hearing.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the video also mentions that age-old question of nature versus nurture.
Right.
So what's the latest on that front?
It's a question that's been around forever, and with ASD, it's definitely not a simple either-or answer.
Hmm.
Genetics obviously play a significant role. If one identical twin is diagnosed with ASD, the other twin has a much, much higher chance of being diagnosed compared to fraternal twins.
So strong genetic component, but not the whole story.
Right. The video mentions this curious correlation that researchers are finding a link between a father's age and ASD.
Yeah, that caught my eye too. What's that connection?
Well, studies are suggesting that as men age, there's a slightly higher chance of genetic mutations happening in their sperm.
Okay.
And some of these mutations have been linked to ASD.
Hmm.
It's still an area of active research for sure, but it really highlights how these factors, genetics and environment, can be intertwined in these super complex ways.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So we've got these brain differences. We've got this interplay of genes and environment. But the video doesn't stop there, right?
Uh,
It also dives into like the social and cultural aspects of autism.
it does.
And that's where this whole idea of the neurodiversity movement comes in. And that's where this whole idea of the neurodiversity movement comes in.
Absolutely. It's a big shift in perspective.
Right.
Instead of viewing ASD and other neurological differences as disorders that need to be fixed, it encourages us to see them as variations in human cognition,
Okay.
each with its own strengths and challenges.
So more like different, not disordered.
Exactly. And with that shift comes a whole new vocabulary.
Mm.
You mentioned earlier you had to look up the terms neurodivergent and neurotypical. The neurodiversity movement really embraces those terms. Neurodivergent covers individuals with ASD, ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurological differences,
Ah.
while neurotypical refers to folks whose brains function within that kind of typical range.
So it's like recognizing that there's no one right way for
Yeah.
a brain to be wired.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what's considered normal.
Right.
The neurodiversity movement really pushes for greater acceptance and understanding and accommodation for neurodivergent individuals.
Which makes a lot of sense, but the video also kind of hints at some tension within the movement itself.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're right. There are definitely varying perspectives within the movement. As some folks believe that we should ditch medical labels and diagnoses altogether and just focus on celebrating neurological differences.
Huh.
They argue that labels can be really stigmatizing and limiting.
And I can see how that would be really empowering for some people.
Absolutely. However, others in the movement, while embracing this idea of neurodiversity,
Right.
also acknowledge that some with ASD face really significant challenges and require support and services.
Sure.
They worry that downplaying those difficulties that some people are facing might lead to their needs being overlooked.
So it's about finding that balance between celebrating differences and making sure that people are getting the support they need to thrive.
Exactly. And the video gives a really powerful example of this tension when it talks about masking,
Okay.
which is something that a lot of individuals with ASD do, often unconsciously, to try to fit in.
Right.
They might suppress their natural behaviors or mimic social cues.
Even though it can be incredibly draining for them.
I bet. Yeah, just that constant effort to be someone you're not.
Absolutely. It can lead to exhaustion, anxiety, even mental health issues.
Wow.
So this is where understanding and acceptance are so crucial.
Right.
Creating environments where people feel safe and supported to truly be themselves, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, is key.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What's the main takeaway for our listeners after this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's so much we're still learning about ASD and neurodiversity.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, there are no easy answers or one-size-fits-all approaches.
Right.
But I think by engaging with these complex issues and challenging our own assumptions and really listening to diverse voices, we can create a much more inclusive and supportive world for everyone. And maybe even uncover some hidden talents and perspectives along the way. If different brain wiring leads to different strengths, imagine the contributions that neurodivergent individuals could make in fields like technology, research, the arts. I mean, anywhere that really requires like a unique way of seeing the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Recognizing the value of all minds.
That is a fantastic note to end on. If this deep dive into neurodiversity has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating topic. And be sure to let us know what other deep dives you'd like to take with us in the future.
Until next time.